On Thanksgiving Eve, 1971, a man in a suit calmly opened the rear stairway of a Boeing 727 in the middle of wind and rain, took $200,000 and vanished from the sky. From that jump, America gained a ghost named D.B. Cooper, the only hijacking that has remained unsolved for more than half a century. We won't digress. The story begins with 3 stubborn remnants, an inexpensive necktie dusted with metallic particles like a factory's pocket diary, $5, 8,000 in decayed bills surfacing at Tina Bar nearly a decade later, and a drop zone map teetering between deep woods and suburb. From these 3 anchors, we trace a path through micro-evidence, the geomorphology of the Columbia River, the flight profile and configuration of the 727, then compare suspect Filesto test, which scenario stands firmer. Cooper survived and melted into everyday life, or Cooper perished in the cold, rainy forest. Hook: if a single tie can reveal the profession of an anonymous man, can $5, 8,000 in decayed cash point the way to the rest of the $200,000 and to Cooper's fate itself? Next, we will reconstruct the night of November 24th, 1971, with specific flight parameters. Step onto Tina Bar to read the river's calendar through diatoms. Unfold the drop map to weigh the forest's edge against the suburbs, walk the suspect's corridor, then lay out 2 composite scenarios, survival and fatality, to see which one can support itself against science, geomorphology, and the record. On Thanksgiving Eve, 1971, the sky over the Pacific Northwest was like a pane of black glass someone had fogged with wind and rain. On Portland's wet runway, a man in a dark suit, neatly knotted tie, dark glasses, and a flat briefcase that looked as if it held nothing but papers, quietly boarded a Northwest Orient Boeing 727. He called himself Dan Cooper. Within hours, that name would slip a single letter in the press and become a moniker that has rung for half a century: D.B. Cooper. The story begins with a small note nudged toward a flight attendant, with a smile that gave nothing away, and with a whisper just loud enough to drown out the engines: "I have a bomb." From that moment, the sealed space of the cabin became a mute stage where the characters spoke little, but every movement echoed danger. His demands were chilling in their simplicity: $200,000 in cash, 4 parachutes, and enough fuel for the aircraft to continue flying after receiving the ransom and releasing passengers. When the plane took off again from Seattle, the sky turned an even deeper shade of coal. The crew complied precisely with the settings the mysterious passenger requested: fly low, fly slow, keep the flaps at a specific angle, and don't let anyone follow too closely. Then, somewhere in the rain, with the clock pushing further into night, the rear air stair opened. A blast of cold air swept through the fuselage like a sigh. The man disappeared into the dark, carrying a money bag lashed tight, leaving behind a cheap tie and a question so large it would haunt the next century. Half a century on that question hasn't faded. It has been sharpened by collective imagination, by the stubbornness of those who chase answers, and by countless clues as small as a metallic speck clinging to a thread. This hijacking was not a brief flare that burned out. It is a banked ember under ash, ready to blaze when stirred. In government archives, boxes heavy with the smell of old paper still breathe unanswered questions. On sandbars downriver on the Columbia, children once bent to the sand lifted decayed bundles of cash and brought the story back to life. What lifts this tale beyond an ordinary criminal case? is how it taps a classic American mythos, a lone daredevil, a leap into darkness, a mystery that resists every modern search technology. If there is a point where fact and legend converge, it lies in this sensation. Everyone seems to know part of the story, but no one grasps the whole picture. People retell the image of the courteous passenger ordering bourbon and soda like a figure from film noir. Rumors pass along clues that never quite align. As time goes on, the outline of this character grows sharper, at once real and collaged from memory and admiration for someone who defied the order of things. We will start with the most rigorously recorded details, retracing the flight path, the weather, the testimonies, even the accumulated era of memory. From there, we'll peel back layers of theory. Who was he? Where did he work? Do microscopic particles on a discarded tie point to a particular industry? Why did ransom bills surface at Tina Bar nearly a decade later? And ultimately, did he land in deep woods or on the outskirts of a town? Each question is a guiding thread pulling us deeper into the weave. But this is not a cold recital. The case has generated a community, people who for years have spent their own money, their own time, and sometimes their patience to glue a speck of dust onto the axle of truth. A hobbyist peers through an electron microscope. An engineer calculates flap settings. A geomorphologist redraws the river's story through layers of sand. A former airline employee recalls procedures that have vanished into history. They are not supporting characters. They are the heartbeat that keeps the fate of an unresolved case alive. And as with every good mystery, the most unsettling thing is not the dark, but the holes in the light. Each time we think we're close to a conclusion, a small detail falls out of step, a number that doesn't match a statement discolored by time, a piece of evidence that suddenly opens a new line of interpretation. That is when the sobriety of investigative journalism must march beside the disciplined imagination of literature. Verify, cross-check, but don't banish the possibility of surprise. That pairing helps us resist the temptation of easy answers. In the chapters ahead, we won't chase emotion, nor will we avoid it. We will examine the context of U.S. aviation in the early 1970s, reconstruct frame by frame the night of November 24th. Step out onto the sandbar where the money surfaced, bow over the tie and its metallic dust, then unfold maps to judge the likeliest landing zones. When the picture seems detailed enough, we'll let the story speak, building opposing scenarios and placing them at the same table. Because if myth consoles us that some things cannot be grasped, investigation reminds us that every mystery has a structure. One man's plunge into a rainy autumn night is a challenge thrown down to physics, meteorology, criminal psychology, and collective memory alike. From that challenge, a complete narrative can be woven from stage to backstage, from fragments to whole. With a single promise, we will go as far as knowledge allows us, bearing in mind that to know may still not be enough. That night is now more than 50 years past. Yet each time wind lashes the tail of a 727 in an archival photo, one seems to hear footsteps ghosting across metal stairs and a figure leaning into the gale. The story begins there, and perhaps it will end there too, at the line where air meets ground, where fact meets imagination, separated by a single step into the void. To understand how a man could board a plane with a briefcase and a bold plan then vanish like breath on glass, we have to step back to a time when America's skies were still ajar. In 1971, airline security was like a finely crafted wooden door with a simple latch, attractive, convenient, and permissive. No baggage scanners, no conveyor-belted rules, no chilly metal detectors chirping in steady rhythm. People bought tickets with cash, and boarding often required little more than a slip of paper with a name. Identity belonged to civilian life, not as a gate one had to pass to reach the sky. In that setting, the Boeing 727 was the star of the medium-haul skies. A slender fuselage, 3 rear-mounted engines, and most crucially, the rear air stair, a door that dropped from the tail, designed to serve small airports without jet bridges. That stairway unintentionally became the portal to legend. When a 727 landed at out-of-the-way runways, crews could lower the stairs and let passengers step off, as if onto a front stoop. From there, the possibility of opening the stairs while aloft was no longer unthinkable. With the right numbers, altitude, speed, flap angle, a wind tunneled into the fuselage, and the passage opened like a corridor into the void. But technology is only half the story. The other half lives in the culture of flying, then a leisurely cadence in America before global security shocks. In the cabin, cigarettes could be legally lit. Hard liquor was poured as a gesture of hospitality. Flight attendants were the face of calm, and the cockpit was a fortress of trust, though a fortress with an unlocked door. Few imagined that in the early 1970s, the U.S. would see a wave of hijackings of many shades, ransom seekers, the desperate wishing to fly to Cuba, the deluded chasing an exit in the sky. Like other carriers, Northwest Orient ran on a simple creed: move people and freight on time. Safety, of course, but safety defined by the standards of the day, focused on flight engineering, maintenance, weather, and dispatch, not on the prevention of ill intent. Crews were trained to handle crises with poise and compromise, prioritize passenger lives, meet demands that avoid violence, and steer the flight back onto the familiar rails of the schedule. This mindset made in-air negotiations an odd ritual of the era the demander lays out conditions. The crew listens, radios the ground. The ground gathers money and fuel, and if fortune holds, everyone bids farewell to a stranger who disappears after getting what he wants. The Pacific Northwest sky is a character in its own right, not a tropical postcard blue, but a heavy cloth of mist and needle rain, especially in late November. Winds sweep in along southwesterly bands, pour over ranks of fir, and ripple over the Cascades like waves against rock. After dark, temperatures can snap a spirit unused to forest and mountain, doubly so in cold rain. In such weather, a low-altitude parachute jump can be both gift less brutal air pressure and curse the ground below a chessboard of rivers, forests, ravines, and bog. Zoom out, and 1971 is a year when America bore spiritual scratches, war unended, protest movements thinning the concept of order. The press mixed drama and liberty, sometimes turning lawbreakers into faintly romantic figures of the age. Not by accident did many hijackers appear on front pages with headlines louder than indictments. Against that collective mood, a polite man who knew his bourbon and kept his word became an inconvenient emblem of misdirected admiration. Someone who challenged the system without firing a shot, who used courtesy as an armor plate. Economics played a quiet role with 3 engines and short field performance. The 727 was agile within a web of small and mid-size airports across the Northwest. That agility unintentionally created opportunity. A plane that could land where few looked closely gave darkness another arm to lend maverick plans. In the control tower, voices traded parameters and even tones. On the ramp, fuel trucks and stairs moved like a well-rehearsed mechanical orchestra. No one imagined that evening would enter the history books, nor that a rear stair mere convenience would become Exhibit A in debates lasting to this day. Even emergency procedures were built on the spirit of negotiation. The philosophy of comply to resolve meant many hijackings ended without gunfire, but it also carved a groove the bold could learn from predecessors. The 1970s saw copycats study one another like recurring musical phrases, the same ransom script, the same inventory of items, the same cool voice before danger. In that score, the Cooper case sounded a sustained low note, a virtuoso variation that made the orchestra pause to listen. And in a beautiful, ruthless irony, aviation technology had reached stunning precision at carrying people from A to B, yet had not evolved enough to erect layered fences between intent and opportunity. At the intersection of refined engineering and rustic security, a man slipped through the seam. From the outside, the gap looked razor thin. For someone calm, prepared, and daring enough, it was a door. Close the background, and one image returns. A 727 cabin, glowing amber, the hush of air conditioning, braided with rain, and a man setting a briefcase on the floor, as if it weighed no more than a story. No scanners, no cues of shoes and belts, no grainy monitors inspecting every trinket. Only the trust of an era and a challenge hurled at it. From here, the next part leads straight into Thanksgiving Eve itself. Every step nod and scribbled note reframed under the cold light of a single threat: I have a bomb. What happened on that Thanksgiving Eve, if replayed like a videotape, moves forward to the tick of a clock, yet passes in the low roar of rain and engines. Portland's afternoon was soaked. The air carried the metallic scent of a freshly wiped runway, and the yellow lamps guided eyes into the warm glow of the terminal. At the ticket counter, a man bought a coach seat, paid neatly, fussed over nothing, and walked through to board like a civil servant rushing home. He chose a row near the back aisle seat, not far from the rear stairs, a position that at the time meant nothing more than convenience. The first shaping moment came quietly. A small note slid toward a flight attendant as if it were a misplaced receipt. "You'd better read this," the man said, voice even and polite. "I have a bomb." No screams, no flamboyant threats, just a heartbeat cinched for an instant, then quickened to adapt. When he opened the briefcase for a glance, metal shapes and wires appeared like a simple diagram built for effect, enough to convince anyone this was no joke. In that sealed airborne space, no one wished to test their luck by verifying authenticity. Negotiations opened like an office deal, $200,000 for parachutes and fuel, sufficient to continue flying after the handoff. On the ground, the airline and authorities raced the clock, gathering small denomination bills, recording serial numbers, calling everywhere to borrow parachutes. In the air, the crew kept cadence, proceed to Seattle per schedule, serve drinks to passengers, maintain a state of new normal in the cabin, a wordless play constructed from quiet. The man ordered bourbon and soda, took a sip, removed his glasses, and put them back on, his gaze fixed, as if thinking of someplace far from here. On landing in Seattle, the era's ritual did its work, comply to conclude. The rear stair remained shut, The forward door opened under control. The ransom arrived in canvas sacks. The parachutes were carried aboard like props for a strange magic act. The passengers, many still unaware, deplaned in turn. No panic, only confusion, small questions trickling along the aisle like the rain outside. In the cockpit, the crew and ground ran the checklist fuel for a long leg south. A plan to fly low and slow with flaps set to a certain angle. The passengers' final demands were restated. No one was to follow too closely, and everyone was to move forward when the rear stair opened. On the second takeoff into the night, the 727 slid through low cloud like a mild-mannered shark. Cabin lights dimmed by order. From the cabin to the tail space was cleared of people. The rear stair was latched for the moment awaiting the command that would turn it into an exit from history. Up front, the captain updated weather. Rain abraded the skin in a steady hiss, as if the weather itself were keeping time for a refined performance. Over radio, calm voices traded headings, altitude, speeds. To the unknowing ear, it was just a lightly loaded night flight. Then the quiet cracked. At the tail, a metallic noise, a small tug like hinges meeting the wind. A cockpit pressure light blinked, odd a sign the air stair was changing state. Forward flight attendants were strapped in, exchanging glances in the dim. The man, his money bag lashed with parachute cord, moved toward the dark. There were no courtesies, no parting words. If anything, it was just shoes touching the stair, a firm hand skimming a cold rail, and a body inclining into the wind. The jump is often described as a fall into nothing, but in truth it resembled a decision prepared to the letter. Altitude low enough to avoid brutal pressure, speed held in a safe band so the stair wouldn't be torn away, a track avoiding the worst cloud. And yet, in late autumn northwest weather, every calculation paid a tax to risk gusts, slanting rain, low-level wind shifts, driven by topography, forest hills, rivers constantly changing. Somewhere below lay a map without lights, except for the few towns glowing like embers. In the cockpit with the stair down, the 727 reacted like a creature scratched just right. A faint shudder, a pressure changed numbers making their small habitual shifts. The crew did not see the man leave. They read what the instruments wrote. That was the only farewell, a signal that the door was open, pressure had dipped, and someone had left the metal shell. They held course per request. No sudden slowdown, no gratuitous climb. Outside sky and rain became perfect accomplices. No cameras, no witnesses, only wind and darkness to attest. On the ground, the story had its own rhythm. Trucks flashed their beacons, clusters of men hunched over maps, rulers scribing slanted lines from estimated coordinates. They tried to fuse the aircraft's path with low-level winds and scant human notes. Someone heard a strange sound above. A dog barked in the rain. For hours afterward, the search apparatus spun up. Patrols, forest sweeps, riverbanks checked at first light. They found only rain-sodden earth and branches broken by their own weight. That night passed without a parachute sighting, without a stray money bag caught in a canopy, without a shoe left by a stream. Years later, when children dug in sand at a downstream bar and lifted decayed bundles of cash, the memory of the jump found something solid to hold. But on that Thanksgiving Eve, all that remained was a cheap tie on a seat, the fading scent of bourbon, and a band of metal at the tail still warm from the friction of wind. What haunts in this sequence is its normal rhythm. No smashing, no shots, no erupting violence. A system ran by its own procedures, and a man who knew those procedures well enough to make them a runway for his plan. From the first note to the final jump, everything unfolded as if rehearsed many times in his mind. A performance with no need of audience, but perfect in structure. As the 727 continued into the night, it became the hollow shell of a newborn mystery. By morning, the press would hunt a name, the public a face, and the principals a point on a map. Yet in that moment, amid rain and the steady drone, the case had chosen its heartbeat, quiet, resilient, patient. That beat would throb for decades, marking each time someone claimed a solution only to surrender before a fresh gap. From this hushed timeline, other stories were woven the exact instant the stair dropped, how cabin pressure fell, why the warning light blinked at that very second, whether there was a tail kick, a small shudder marking a money bag tug in the center of gravity, whether the jumper came down into deep forest or a silent suburb. Every later theory, however lofty, must plant its feet here on that rainy evening in a 727 flying slow. A man passed through a metal door and chose the dark. To grasp the audacity of the jump, we need to step inside the metal body of the Boeing 727, a structure born for the docility of civil airways, not for escapades ripped from heist fiction. The 727 is a three-engine bird, all clustered at the rear. That tail-heavy layout creates a relatively calm zone behind the wing and forward fuselage, like a small room separated from the worst turbulence. There, the rear air stair, a door that lowers from the tail, was meant to serve small airports lacking jet bridges, yet it unintentionally became a staircase leading from the order of a cabin into the vastness of night. Don't picture the air stair as a hatch that flips and a body that rockets out as in a movie. It's a hinged assembly that lowers on an angle, forming a stepped plane protruding into the airstream. At low speed, around 200 knots, and below 10,000 feet, the flow past the tail won't rip the stair away, but it will make every step vibrate like a ruler at a fan's mouth. Each footfall is shoved sideways. The rail is cold and damp. The smell of metal blends with rain and fuel. There's no room for mistiming. Yet, within this moderate turbulence pocket, if the jumper holds posture, the entry into open air can settle into a stable slide the instant the back meets the wind. Why was the jump aerodynamically possible? The answer lies in the precision of the man's demands. Keep flaps at 15 degrees to boost lift at low speed, descend to altitudes that don't brutalize an unacclimated body, and keep the cabin unpressurized so opening the door doesn't unleash a violent pressure snap. Those numbers don't come from hunches. They read like the language of someone who knew how the aircraft behaved or who had studied it long enough to internalize a plan. Still, physics plays favorites with no one. Low speed keeps the stair intact, but puts the body at a threshold between falling and gliding. Pop the chute too early, and tail vortices can collapse the canopy. Too late, and the darkness denies a good read on the ground. On a late November northwest night, every variable exacts a toll: gusts, slanting rain, low-level shear from terrain forest hills, rivers shifting constantly. Below is a map without streetlights, save for stray towns glowing like coals. Think through the pre-jump sequence as a set of moves rehearsed in the mind. He cinches the money bag to his hip, paper turned to lead. checks the rig ripcord chest strap, leg straps, all in wind and metal groan. Hand-to-rail body canted into the slipstream like a surfer setting an edge before the wave. The second or third step is the decision, leave the last tread, no hesitation dive along the vector of air he's already felt. A persistent question, did drop in the air stair create a tell? Readable in the cockpit pinpointing the moment of the jump. At those speeds and settings, tiny changes at the tail echo as numbers on the panel. A mass of a few dozen kilos leaving the stair won't make the airplane sag, but it will nudge pressure and angle of attack by a whisker. For a forewarned crew, that's enough of a signal. To everyone else, it's just another micro flutter in the mechanical symphony. That enough but not excessive signal blurs the time stamp, and with it stretches the possible landing swath for dozens of miles. Survival math asks, what does a night jumper into cold, wet woods need? Shoot light compass, pocket knife map, windproof layers, the bare list. Yet by witness accounts, the man wore a suit dress shoes, a light overcoat carried money, and little else. The clash between urbane attire and outdoor survival is a knot. Some believe he aimed for non-wild terrain where he could ditch the tie and slip into a gas station or roadside motel. Others insist if he was trained, necessary items might have been prepared to evade notice: a stashed jacket, a small flashlight, or simply someone waiting below. Physics still has another say, the money bag. Lashing cash to the body is sensible, but it turns the jumper into an asymmetrical mass, skewing the fall. A slight offset in the cord pulls the center of gravity and spins the body like a top. In rain and wind, that's a dizzying spiral. To correct the jumper must be calm. Spread out pull lines. Find a stable attitude, count enough seconds to clear the tail wash, then pull. All of it happens in heartbeats. Memory later exaggerates into eternity. If one argues the jump was impossible, history murmurs that nighttime military drops weren't rare in that era. Anonymous people stepped into black air, trusting only webbing and technique. The difference here is the 727's air stair departure isn't from a flat cargo ramp, but a slanted cross-blasted ladder. Misjudge the feel and fear devours skill. Master it, and the night is unpleasant, not fatal. One more subtle factor sound. At the tail, the wind isn't a howl, but a sustained field like a far waterfall. That sound dilates time, pushing the mind into a blank focus where every small motion becomes arithmetic. When leaving the last step, the jumper no longer hears his pulse, only wind holding him on the threshold. The decision must come from trained muscle, not a mind still debating. All this leads to a modest conclusion. A jump off a 727's air stair in late November rain is a boundary game of aeronautics, of physiology, of psychology, of terrain, not a miracle, not certain suicide, a narrow door wide enough for someone who knows how to pass through. On that Thanksgiving Eve, such a door was pushed open by a chain of precise requests voiced by a man in a suit and dark glasses. From that technical edge, the narrative naturally slides to the edge of evidence, the scraps left when the figure vanished, the cheap tie, stray threads, the after scent of bourbon, 2 unused parachutes, the parachute cord on the money bag, and years later, decayed bundles rising from a riverside sandbar. Each is a fallen letter from the main text rolling on the tabletop, waiting for someone to pick it up, blow off the dust, and try to fit it back into a sentence. So let us bend over the table and gather the fragments. Sometimes Truth doesn't enter by the front door. It slips under the threshold on a draft, clings to a cheap silk tie, and waits for us to call it by name. When the air stair closed behind the nameless man, the 727 plodded on through its night like a taciturn fish. On a seat near the rear, something small was left behind, or rather deliberately placed as if a stamp half stuck to an unaddressed letter. The tie. Dark brown, cheap, a generic style you could buy at any department store. If evidence had a voice, the tie would speak softly. I was here, snug at the throat of a man who knew how to make a neat knot, how to hide, and how to leave when no one was ready. In the years that followed, the tie would be examined under many lenses, microscopes, skepticism, and the craving for a small thing to confess something large. At first, it was just cloth that might hold fingerprints, hairs, sweat, the basics of investigation. With time and more refined techniques, the tie revealed stranger dust, unusual metallic specks, tiny stars snagged in the weave. Under the light, they glittered in a way unlike household dust. People began to tell stories about foundries, titanium plants, and stainless parts polished so fine their dust bore the signature of a trade. But step away from the microscope for a moment. Look at the knot. A cheap tie doesn't preclude a meticulous person. The knot by those who handled it was neither rushed nor clumsy, tied by someone used to wearing a tie daily, or at least unbothered by spending a few extra seconds on a small detail. That gesture, if you listen, tells something equally important: habit, routine, or a role rehearsed well. This man wanted to appear a courteous office type before he turned into a silhouette at the rear stair. Along the carpeted aisle where shoes had passed lay a few fibers fine as silk. Threads, things no one notices, are clothing's diary. They record shades, dyes, and sometimes the dust of a long day. Nearby, the scent of bourbon thinned in the cabin air, a fragrance people call politeness with proof. Maybe it was the taste of a gentlemanly performance, maybe a buffer for nerves before the hardest part of the plan. In that dose, alcohol doesn't make hands shake. It softens the voice, slows the gaze, and lets time slide. 2 unused parachutes, the props that never went on stage, remained like lengths of timber. They could tell of provenance packing, style the fact that one was trainer and one live, how an experienced jumper would choose a ripcord where to place a reserve. Suppose the man opened one pack fingertips on heavy canopy fabric, a course trustworthy, feel the back of a dependable animal. Yet he didn't take them. He left them as if certain the item he needed lay elsewhere, or as if his plan already assumed that enough meant not cumbersome. The parachute cord binding the money bag that is the boldest line in the picture. Grab cash with hands and it becomes confetti in the wind. Tying it to the body is the only sensible move. But how you tie it is a center of gravity problem. He seems to have handled it cleanly, money cinched at the hip. Cord tight enough not to bruise, tight enough not to slip when the body hit air. Any marks the cord left were washed by wind and rain. All that remains are inferences magnetic, needles mumbling toward north. Crime scene work always wrestles time, and here time sided with rain. Cabins are cleaned by procedure, ramps run like machines, the stage must be reset for the next act. The moment a 727 became the scene of a crime, it was also returning to its role in logistics. How many traces were wiped away as the day's dust? How many tiny bits, if saved, might have finished a sentence? Questions like these are late clicks of a lock heard only after we've stepped outside. Then there's the less material but richly informative thing, testimony. Flight attendants, pilots, ground staff, money couriers, each contributed a fragment of memory. They spoke of a deep voice, precise instructions, a manner neither threatening nor soft. These accounts, even faded at the edges, kept a hard outline, a person in control, not impatient, not flustered, not boastful, a quiet that subdues variables, not the fuzziness of the unprepared. Yet the biggest piece of evidence wasn't on the plane. It lay where few imaginations would look, a riverside sandbar where a boy would dig up rubber-banded bundles of money already dissolving. Before following the child to the water's edge, we circle back once more to the empty seat and the tie. Among those ordinary fibers, investigators found micro-traces, metallic particles and crystals like tiny letters, each letter with the potential to name a real-world noun, foundry, alloy, production line, aerospace plant. If a tie can retain a diary of the air around a neck, history's nib reappears. Perhaps the man lived with metallic dust for years. Perhaps his shirts knew the smell of industrial oil. Perhaps the hand that tied the knot was the same one that traced technical diagrams. Of course, a tie cannot assign a name. It can only propose possibilities, and those possibilities summon a parade of theories. He worked in aviation in a specialty steel plant, or did he merely pick up dust during a one-off visit? Every question opens a crossroads. At those crossings, official investigators and amateur sleuths argue, each holding a map inked with different dashed lines. That's when we see the double-edged evidence, however small, is never just thing. It is a knife that gives hope and demands humility. One more invisible but weighty exhibit, the requested flight configuration remembered and logged. It points to a mind with a schematic already drawn flap angle, altitude, speed, route, offset. A tie might belong to anyone. A string of parameters belongs only to those who've lived with them in service in school or in long private study. Here, the intangible evidence stains like ink, hard to scrub from the inference that he knew the aircraft from the inside, not merely from a coach seat. Leaving the 727 and its seats, we carry a small pouch of fragments. Evaporated booze, a tidy knot, loose threads, metallic dust, 2 unused chutes, a length of cord, and calm testimony. They're light enough to blow away on a gust, yet heavy enough to persist 50 years in memory. Set that pouch down by the river, and a picture flickers among sand grains. Ragged bills tell a story of water time and a journey that began in a man's hands and ended in the riverbed. That moment has arrived. From the cabin with its tie, we step onto Tina Bar, where a child's curiosity met the serial numbers of a case, where sand and water conspired to write the next chapter in silt. Hey, if the tie was a whisper in the cabin, the decayed bundles are the river's patient knock. We kept a fragment for you. Do you have the patience to listen? One morning in the early 1980s, the Columbia River's bank offered nothing special beyond the smell of freshwater algae and the rasp of sand underfoot. A curious child, the classic curiosity of an 8-year-old, dug a toy shovel into the gray sand. The sand cracked apart in damp slabs, weeping water, and just beneath the surface, something glinted, not a bottle shard or shell. It was the edge of a greenish strip of paper crumbling like a leaf in rain. A small hand tugged, and an entire bundle of cash came, free rubber bands already rotting. Then a second bundle, a third. When the adults, startled, bent down, the numbers on those $20 bills flashed like Firefly serials, matching the ransom list from years before. If the tie was a whisper in the cabin, the bundles at Tina Bar were a drumbeat from the riverbed, a rough drumbeat, not crisp bills, not a neatly bagged exhibit, but ragged pieces, edges gnawed by water fibers swollen with time. The rubber bands had decayed into threads, like algae. Counted up, only $5,800 remained. Why only that much? Why here far downstream from the presumed drop zone? Why were the bundles still intact? Each question is a small knife nicking the storyline we thought ran straight. Like every outdoor tale, Tina Bar begins with geomorphology. The Columbia at this reach isn't a straight blue line on a map. It's a moving body swallowing and spitting sand by season, reshaping its bed under human orders. In the mid-1970s, dredging to keep the shipping channel clear hoisted vast cubic yards of bottom sand and dumped it on banks to fight erosion. New sand layered over old like time shuffled. If the bundles had once lain underwater, one can picture a strange journey, drifting, snagging, being buried for a time, then a mechanical campaign in 1974 lifting them toward a second grave on a constructed bar. Or perhaps they never traveled far at all. Perhaps someone planted them here by hand, by intention, as part of a plan that never fully hatched. That feel of brought versus self arrived at Tina Bar as a hairline, diatoms clinging to the bill surfaces microscopic to the naked eye. Later testified the paper had lived underwater. But when is a separate question? Spring here blooms different diatoms than summer. The river changes character with snowmelt floods. Bars inflate and deflate to the pulse of weather. If spring species left their mark, did the bundles rest somewhere underwater not long before discovery? Or did they wander for years, accreting layers too thin to separate by season? Science offers possibilities, while a riverside breeze slowly dusts a little sand back over the bundle's edge, as if nature were reminding us it keeps no hurried schedule. So, Tina Bar became a crossroads of two tribes, investigators with rulers, maps, and logic, and storytellers with intuition, local memory, and private obsessions. One points to charts and speaks of a 1974 dredge-cut docks and shifting depth. Another kneels and lifts a scrap, imagining a hand that once buried it, not a child's, but an adult's, long ago. In that dialogue, the bar takes no side. It guards its secret with the silence of silt. A common argument runs if cash fell from the sky in 1971, why did it surface in 1980? And why still banded water is not gentle enough to cradle bundles like a parcel. Current sand rolling burial all tend to disorder. Rubber bands hugging a shape feel like nature winking at tidy logic. Others rebut decay as uneven, and wet sand, not rushing water, can act as a mold, pressing, holding, and preserving form. A bundle forgotten in the belly of a sandbar may live like an artifact, its skin rags out the structure holds. Imagine one scenario: the man landed nearer than we think, escaped, quickly stashed part of the money somewhere along the river system, intending to return. Time, accident, or fear kept him away. In some season flood 8, the bank swallowed the cash and sent the bills down a watery goat path to a depression. Years later, a dredge's clamshell arm crawled by, lifted the whole sediment slab, and tipped it at Tina Bar. There the sand dried. The surface became a playground. A toy shovel found the right coordinate. Plausible, or perhaps only a well-made story, persuasive the way a poem with meter is. Another scenario: someone not Cooper found part of the money on a shore in a net and buried it at Tina Bar as a marker or misdirection. Buried shallow enough for a child to strike. But why the motive could be foolish, some dark joke or practical burning evidence by returning it to the river. Others go further that the child did not happen upon it, that the discovery was staged. Yet, extreme theories often starve for motive. If Tina Barr meant to lie, it would have needed to lie about much more than a few bundles. At the edge of the sandbar, numbers keep whispering. The serials match the list kept by banks and investigators. That matches a nail in the plank. This money belongs to that case, but that very nail doesn't fix the wobble of the plank, the money's path. It's the kind of mystery where an exhibit both answers and breeds questions. Authentic bills, yes. Authentic route, not yet. It's like standing before a map with a compass and no road. Geomorphologists step in carrying the patience of rock. They read grain-sized bedding flood marks. They speak of migrating sand islands, eddies, flow geometry. Each technical term lands like a pebble on the table, gradually shaping a shoreline. When they raise the possibility of fill moved from dredge sites, the picture expands to barges, discharge pipes, and the second grave discourse. When they talk flood cycles, we hear a water clock. Diatoms bloom, banks slump, bottoms shift. Then the season resets. In that repetition, if the bundles were caught in rhythm, they could travel through several sandbar lives before showing their face. But Tina Barr isn't only water's story. It's a story of people searching. Since the bundles surfaced, the place has become a pilgrimage site for those who believe a different shovel could open the mystery wide. They pace the shore eyes, sweeping ripples, listening to pebbles click underfoot, hoping for one more bundle, one more clue. The Barr answers with impartial stinginess. It rarely gives. Perhaps because the story wants to end at suggestive, not sufficient. Whichever scenario one favors, we must admit the Tina Barr bundles are a bridge between the rainy night of 1971 and a morning in 1980. A peculiar bridge fog in the middle, yet precisely this bridge anchors the case to earth. It keeps the tale from floating off into pure legend. It drags the nameless man back to a world of wet sand, blooming algae, dredge barges, and children lifting a treasure they cannot spend. From this bridge, the path runs to another bank of the story at a lab bench, where a tie and its dust titanium bismuth stainless open a route that sounds fictional but is hard as steel. Perhaps that is Tina Barr's private magic. It teaches us to hear time with fingers in sand. Every grain is a second. Every layer is a chapter. A bundle of cash disintegrates paper fibers, splay like algae fronds, a sentence broken mid-phrase. The reader, us, must supply the missing words. But however we fill them, we must keep the river's voice slow, patient, occasionally teasing. Leaving the bar brushing sand from our hands, we return to the lab table. There, the tie waits, and its dust microstars of titanium bismuth steel stands ready to tell a different story. Factories, production lines, the faint air of cutting oil. If Tina Barr gives us a geomorphology of money, those specs give us a geomorphology of work. Two maps, two strata, can they overlay cleanly enough to suggest a face? No one knows yet. The only way to find out is to keep our heads down and be as patient as sand. In the modest labs of civilian sleuths, the cheap tie became the lead character. It lay still beneath the microscope like a fabric desert, and on the surface of the weave, countless tiny boulders appeared, microparticles so small they needed thousands of times magnification to take shape. Each dust mote bore an industrial fingerprint, cool flakes of titanium, sharp-edged bits of bismuth, slivers of stainless steel, gleaming like night mirrors. This wasn't the random lint of an office. It was the dust of production lines of specialty alloys of a world where metals are melted, rolled, pickled, plated, and exhale particles with the identity of a trade. That image, a metallic sky glittering across a cheap strip of cloth, suggests a hidden resume at the collar. The man may have worked among chemical vats and titanium rollers and plants that made aerospace components, or at least regularly passed through such spaces. Many stories were spun from there. He was a metallurgical engineer, a quality control tech, a logistics worker who moved through specialty facilities, or belonged to aviation in the broad sense, working near the places where metal takes wing. The dust as silent name tags hints at a way of life. Each night, when he took off his tie, he shook loose tiny shooting stars of industry. Skepticism sat at the same table. Careful voices warned that the more seductive an exhibit, the more it must be stripped of charm. Could those metal particles be investigative contamination residue from fingerprint powders, from metal tools used during storage, or from countless foreign motes acquired over decades of handling? Was the tie preserved in clean conditions from the very first days, or was it opened, refolded, relocated each time an opportunity for worldly dust to masquerade as shop floor dust? The point isn't to dismiss conclusions, but to tighten the logical chain. If dust is the diary of a trade, we must prove the diary wasn't overwritten. Dust readers, however, didn't rely on sparkle alone. They weighed elemental percentages, compared grain shapes, and recognized signatures of particular processes, say titanium-rich coatings for high-heat environments, or bismuth antimony systems present in certain surface treatments. They overlaid this with the Northwest's industrial map specialty alloy foundries, aerospace subcontractors' production lines, whose dust could settle on a commuting collar. The convergence between a dust map and a factory map isn't identification, but it is a roadmap. It won't take you to a front door, but it tells you which streets to knock on first. There was also non-metal dust, the dust of habit. On the tie traces suggested matchbooks, tobacco, small clues that line up with the early portrait of a polite man who smoked. Here, 2 layers work dust and lifestyle dust stack into a single image, someone of both shop floor and salon, fluent in parameters and in ordering a drink. The image is almost too smooth, hence worth digging into. Good science asks not only what, but how. How do microparticles cling so firmly to fiber static in a machine room skin oils providing tack, or a workplace haze settling like dew? How do they survive years of handling and storage while other traces decay? The answer lies in the particles themselves, tiny and light, with geometries that lock into threads, chemically inert to moisture, resistant to hydrolysis, unlike organic fibers. A soft exhibit paper money fell apart. A hard one, dust kept speaking in a steady voice. An intriguing turn in any analysis is the moment the investigator realizes the tie does not belong to the moment of the hijacking, but to the long history of a neck. It speaks to years before that rainy night. This shifts the focus rather than fixating on November 24, 1971. We must consider a man's occupational routine over many years. The suspect list changes accordingly. Fewer swashbucklers, more factory folk. Fewer gun hands, more calloused fingers, and technical pens. The silhouette thus becomes less romantic, yet more embodied. Debate over contaminated evidence didn't retreat. Some insisted that any object handled enough times risks becoming an artifact rather than a pristine exhibit. They told stories of envelopes opened, photos taken, public showings, each a risk. The counter looked for consistent signatures, particle types recurring at non-random ratios, compared to dust baselines on unrelated items from the era to separate ambient from specific. The argument didn't produce a chorus, but forced both sides to sharpen their standards. That is healthy for truth. Deeper down, the dust tale speaks to social geography. High-end alloy facilities aren't everywhere. They cluster near industry rail ports or aerospace primes. A tie crusted with such dust pulls the narrative toward towns with smokestacks, guarded gates, and hazard placards. It takes us from windswept sandbars to engineers' conference rooms, from the smell of algae to cutting oil. And their one conclusion is almost certain. The man in the cabin was not jobless. When the dust analysis pauses, it leaves two legacies. First, an industry map laid over the case-specific trades becoming more noteworthy than others. Second, a lesson in reading small things. See the factory in a speck. Hear the rolling mill in a glint. This case, with a poetry verging on perverse, asks us to believe that some secrets only speak to microscopes. When we close the scope and inhale the faint metallic scent on cloth, the story leads to another lab where water, not metal, has the floor. For if metal dust is the language of the shop, diatoms are the river's tongue. One teaches us to hear machines, the other to hear water. Only by setting the two side by side can we hope to compose a melody close to the truth, where the money traveled when it paused and why it surfaced at Tina Bar on a damp morning. If metal dust is the dry, crisp voice of the shop floor, then diatoms, single-celled organisms with silica shells, are the damp whisper of rivers. Under a scanning electron microscope, a $20 bill becomes a speckled glass meadow where tiny coffin-shaped diatom frustules lie scattered like hieroglyphs. Few realize it, but each diatom species blooms to a seasonal rhythm, preferring very specific conditions of light temperature, turbidity, and dissolved minerals. So when they cling to the surface of an object, paper, money, for instance, they leave a timestamp, not a number, but the pattern of months. When the Tina Bar bills were carefully cleaned and placed under the scope, they testified that they had lived underwater, not merely splashed or rained on, but submerged long enough for diatom remains to settle and lock into the cellulose like fine sand in a rock fissure. The diatom forms found some spring-loving others booming as waters warmed and light increased, hinted that immersion might not have matched the 1971 night, but a later season when the river cycle invited them. Fragile paper turned into film stock, it recorded light by the ghosts of tiny life. This pulls our thinking away from a naive straight line, fell from the plane, lay there until found. If those species are the characters of spring, perhaps the bundles drifted grounded, then were developed by spring waters. Perhaps they once lay on the bottom of a quiet pocket and eddy a hollow behind a bar, then moved by human mechanics, dredging bank fill to Tina Bar diatoms won't draw a step-by-step route, but they can title a chapter, the chapter of immersion, not of fall. In that same lab, someone tapped a finger and raised contamination concerns. Could washing, fiber separation, or transport have introduced modern diatoms? The cautious replied with processed distilled water clean environments, local ecological baselines compared over years, and repeated findings across multiple fragments. If random, it is remarkably consistent, If contamination, it would have to recur ritualistically, rituals absent from the notes. Science bows, but it isn't naive. Diatoms also teach another lesson: the speed of wet time. Submerged paper doesn't rot like wood, but its cellulose network swells and weakens. If the bundles lay too long underwater, they would have pulped. Yet many notes remained legible enough for cereals, their edges blistered but intact. That suggests a delicate window long enough for diatoms to settle, not long enough for total destruction or immersion. In multiple short bouts, tides floods like a book dipped and lifted by an unseen hand. The image, a money book flipped by the river's hand, is poetic enough to make even an investigator smile. Ecological comparisons add frames. Do the diatom assemblages at Tina Bar differ from known assemblages in nearby reaches? Is there any indicator species pointing to still dredge ponds versus flowing mainstem? Taken together, answers sketch a landscape. The bills once sat in quiet water, fine sediment rich with enough light in the brighter season, a refuge pocket inside a constantly molting river. This suits both scenarios: drift snag, dredge dump, or shallow burial bank slump. Eddy rest, mechanical reappearance. Here diatoms become a moral compass of inquiry. They don't name a cacher or a digger, but they frustrate overly straight stories. They say, there was water, there was time. They don't say, where whose. They make simplifications earn a chuckle from sand and current. That restraint is why they're trustworthy. They promise no more than they know. Yet, science will tell stories if pressed correctly. Splice the immersion chapter of diatoms to the transport chapter of geomorphology from Tina Bar. Set beside them the tying chapter of human behavior, the money bag at the hip, and the survival chapter of a rainy night. The picture deepens if the jumper died in the woods. Money is hard-pressed to reach a river with bands intact. If he lived and hit it, money shouldn't so readily sign the diatom ledger. The middle ground where accident, flood, human machinery, and silt's habits meet becomes the promised land of hypotheses. And like every good story, a small tale opens a larger question. Once invisible to the eye, diatoms become witnesses. They testify by silica geometry, seasonal habit, and patient presence in paper fibers. Leaving the lab, you still hear them: the brittle clink of glass shells in a tray, the hiss of alcohol evaporating, the scratch of pencil underlining species names. Outside wind lifts off the river. We know now that to understand the truth of a case, one sometimes must read the calendar of water. From here, the narrative turns naturally to the map, where we try to pin a point on the ground for the jump that rainy night. If diatoms give us when, the drop map must give us where. As with every search for coordinates, this path will begin with confident straight lines, then wobble in subterranean gusts of terrain, and finally halt at an uncomfortable boundary between deep forest and suburb. After the labs of water and metal, we unfold a paper map, the old tool that stubbornly resists the digital age. From Seattle, a serpentine flight path glints like a silver snake sliding over fir forests, rivers, and towns that flicker sparsely before sinking back into rain. Somewhere along this line, a human body and a money bag left the fuselage. One question hangs like a yellow lamp in the room: was the landing zone a silent mountain forest or a basin of suburbia with asphalt and gas stations? Those who favor clarity start with numbers: airspeed, altitude, flap angle, wind. That night, The 727 flew low and slow. The track angled south with small course changes reported over radio. When the rear air stair dropped, a cockpit instrument blinked an eyelash of a needle that years later many would treat like a church bell. Using that blink as a marker, cartographers draw an arc based on speed and elapsed time searching a probable landing area near names that already sound cold. The lower Lewis River around Ariel dark, ink blocks of forest and plains quiet as black water. The Deep Woods School relies on the intuition of terrain and weather. A late November night of rain, slanting wind, low temperatures, dense forest that swallows sound. They outline a wide perimeter prioritizing slopes and narrow valleys. They believe that even if the landing didn't kill him, the jumper became a ghost in the trees, eventually folded into nature's missing statistics. If he died, they say everything makes more sense. The river takes the evidence down in a long chain of seasons. Gear decays. The body sinks into dust. No one finds a thing. At the next table, the suburb school lays out pinpricks of light along Interstate 5, late open gas stations, picket fences shimmering in the rain. They note the jump wasn't from a crazy altitude. A prepared, calm person could gamble on coming down in the lowlands where every mile brings a store, a motel, a truck stop. If he lived, they say, then the second step after popping the harness is shedding the persona he used to board the plane. A different coat, a pulled-down hat, a coffee receipt, and he melts into the wet crowd. Scattered testimonies from that night, like raindrops on a windshield, each run their own way, yet mention odd sounds. Overhead, the lights of a military plane following at a distance, the feel of a pressure change. Each detail points a blurry finger, turning the landing map into torn lace holes, edges places that stretch and shrink. A farmer says he heard a thump from above. A motorist swears he saw a canopy like a drifting leaf. Such stories drift in and out like breath too light to nail down a coordinate, but enough to shake the table. And then the river, the geography's accomplice. If Deep Woods is right, the river acts in the later acts. Floods drag evidence downhill over a string of years. If Suburb is right, the river may appear in the opening scene. The jumper picks a lowland edge, avoids the densest forest, and while stripping lines and changing clothes, crosses murky ditches that feed the Columbia, leaving accidental traces like a torn slip of paper caught in reeds. Same supporting, actor water, two different scripts. Those who reconstruct physics talk about tailwind wake vortices, the aircraft's wind shadow. At that speed, deploying too early could have the canopy crushed by turbulence. Too late, and the fall sinks into a zone where human eyes lose to instruments. Some draw the fall as a slanted cut on the map, arguing the weighted money bag pulled the body southwest. Others counter that corrective bodywork could neutralize it for a near vertical drop. In these debates, only one consensus emerges: uncertainty. After all the measuring, the map remains a map of many ifs. Stand at the forest edge near Ariel at midnight. Rain threads the air. Resin is damp. The ground alternates between mush and firm. In that scene, a man in wet dress, shoes a money bag cinched at his hip, eyes stung by wind, has minutes to decide which way to find a road. Night forest offers no signs, only water sounds and gradients. With luck, he hits a trail and the sky lightens. The roofline glow of a farm or a lane becomes breadcrumb in a fairy tale. Without luck, every step snuffs a candle. A man who demanded flaps 15 probably knows more about orientation than a stroller. If so, the suburbs aren't a fantasy. It may also be, as stubborn mysteries often allow, that the answer is a boundary line, the seam between woods and plain, an apron where two worlds touch. A wet pasture fading into thin trees with a gas station roof and the hush of a freeway 3 miles off. Land on the seam, and you get both darkness that hides you and a path to a road. Land in the deep forest, and you get killing stillness. Land in the heart of suburbia, and you risk being seen. Someone who wants to vanish would wish for the seam. We latecomers must heed both choirs and accept that the drop map will never frame as neatly as a cadastral plan. It's a living picture where each data layer stacks under a layer of rain. The beauty and cruelty is that both schools own pieces that make their stories sound right. Deep Woods has weather and fatality odds. Suburb has human behavior and pavement. Thus, the debate stretches like a parachute cord. No one will cut trim one side, the other cries incomplete. Trim the other, this side cries overreach. But the case needs more than a coordinate. It needs a face. Pull the map closer, and the suspects become colored pins each. A life story, an old photo, a half confession, an alibi that doesn't quite hold. Some match the physique. Some know enough to demand parameters. Some worked with the very metals dusted on the tie. Every name tugged the landing zone toward itself. A man from Utah pulls you into desert. A Washingtonian pulls you into timber. A Boeing belt worker pulls you toward Seattle's satellite towns. The 1971 night map is therefore not purely geography. It's sociology pasted on cardboard. And though we still can't nail one point, the narrative must move. Because just beyond terrain, maps lie human files, names raised and lowered by headlines, portraits over-inked by authors, coincidences undone by contrary facts. From forest and suburb, we step into an imaginary interview room where suspects parade like shadows. There, where did he land yields for a time to who was he? And perhaps the second answer will throw light back onto the first night's coordinates. The roster of names that walks down this case's suspect hallway is as long as a lifetime address book. Each name is a black and white frame, eyes dodging the lens, a half smile, an old uniform, an employee badge yellowed with age. They resemble one another in that each fits the big story with one suspicious piece, parachute experience, a trade tied to metals, a life path that crosses Seattle, and they differ in that none fits all the way. That keeps our imagined interview room lit, but rarely echoing with the gavel of conclusion. The first to be named are often products of the public's instinct to compare. He hijacked a plane in an eerily similar way. In that file, the shadow of a man from the Mountain West appears used similar technique once jumped off a rear door with a large ransom had already proven the jump wasn't madness. But similar is not the same. Timelines, physical evidence movements, and cross-checked statements laid side by side like planks of a raft ultimately drift apart in the rapids. The first lesson is simple. A case can spawn copies, but copies don't erase the original. Others draw attention because of industrial geography. They worked near where metal takes wing passing each morning through the gates of specialty alloy plants. Their shirts carried the same glittering dust seen under the microscope on the tie. In their language, technical letters dissolve into everyday sentences like salt in water. But when we pull the chair closer, the hottest question returns. Do they have an alibi for Thanksgiving Eve? Where were they when the 727 slid through the rain? Any connection to the requested gear parachute's money bag cord? Or are they merely people from similar environments? Often, the answers stop right at the boundary that keeps suspicion alive but won't hold in place. Some take center stage for temperament. They like to tell life stories, sometimes half-joking confessions in the warmth of drink. A widow or an old friend whispers, "He once said things only an insider would know." On a winter evening in a warm kitchen, relative places a name on the table like setting down a long-carried burden. Such late confessions often carry the rhythm of a private tragedy, the hunger to be remembered. Yet, when placed beside the technical serial numbers, flight times, the drop map, the fit shrinks to expose the frail core of memory and wish. There are also names glued to aviation's social structure. Airline employees, airport staff handlers, the roles close enough to hear the language of flaps. At 15, the jumper used. They knew procedures, how to negotiate with a crew, how a rainy night makes a schedule pliant. With them, the blade sharpens could someone that versed in the inside game, fool colleagues, and escape the mirror of the workplace? The answer is never absolute. Those who know much also draw many eyes. Knowledge can be both key and shackle. In every dossier, a vocational shadow flickers. Veterans, especially paratroops, carry the posture of people who understand wind and the quiet of discipline. Alloy plant workers carry titanium dust on collars and calluses on fingertips. Route planners carry radio jargon in their breath. The case is like a jigsaw where each piece belongs to a different box. One shard matches the left corner, but the rest won't fit. Switch pieces, and you match a skyline while the city vanishes. A composite portrait, someone who knows aircraft and metals, keeps cool in a suit, yet lives amid cutting oil, keeps appearing and dissolving. Even so, the public eye still prefers a hero or anti-hero to hang on the wall. Some names become characters in books and documentaries, dressed in literary tones that the record cannot bear. That mechanism pleases the heart more than the evidence a good story draws better than a string of dry memos. Which is why, whenever a name is hoisted high, the fall can be brutal. A single counter artifact, a work roster, a photo from that night. A motel receipt from elsewhere can collapse the glittering stage like paper scenery. Now and then the case nearly pivots on a late-found object, a dusty parachute in a barn, a shop note from a smelter, a long-forgotten bus ticket in a wooden box. Such artifacts streak like meteors, they flare, make us look up and go dark. Sometimes they open a new path. More often, they only thicken the faith that the mystery still breathes. Either way, they offer a gracious reminder no mystery is wholly mute. It speaks softly. To hear it, investigators must learn when to be silent. What nags most is the consistency of that composure stance. Early accounts of the jumper agree he was not aggressive, not boastful, not trembling. That is the demeanor of someone used to taming variables, someone whose work punishes error. Placed on the table beside metal dust and technical language, a draft portrait emerges, a person raised in a world of procedure, not of luck. Someone who set parameters before stepping through a metal door into wind. Leaving the suspect hallway, we carry a double feeling irritation that no single name can be nailed down, relief that the narrative isn't locked by a clumsy answer. Uncertainty, though uncomfortable, is the space where investigative ritual belongs, where each hypothesis must feed itself on evidence, not charm. From here, we look toward the official machinery, 3 letters on the building front, that has run with this story for decades, to see how a large apparatus has worked tired and learned to breathe differently. Because this case isn't only a chase between one man and the sky, it's a dialogue between the public and an institution with a 3-letter name. Their story has less on-screen drama, but it is the force explaining why the mystery endures, how evidence is kept, how files are opened, how information is shared, and how a decision is made to suspend active pursuit ripples that still lap at us today. In windowless rooms under harsh white tubes that tire the eyes, a cadre has walked alongside this case for decades. Shifts changed generations, turned over technology evolved. Only the cardboard boxes stayed the same, heavy, thick, labeled with numbers that can turn truth into procedure. Investigation in the public imagination is pounding boots and yellow tape. Here, investigation is mostly turning pages, stamping forms, listening to phone tips that last a breath and die, and carefully writing, received, recorded. In the early years, the apparatus worked like a clamshell dredge. Anyone who called anyone with an uncle who had grown cryptic, anyone who claimed to have found a scrap of canopy, all were taken in and routed. Some nights, the hotline burned like a stove. Some weeks, only the clock ticked. Every tip was a new footpath, but the machine had only so many feet. The crucial skill wasn't chase, it was sift. Vague statements went to the left bin, leads with physical exhibits to the right, and between them lay a gray belt of professional intuition, what outsiders call gut, and insiders call the smell of this thing. As forensic science entered the era of micro traces and DNA, the vault keepers lifted old box lids with due reverence. The cheap tie now became a relic, placed in the hands of modern instruments and scopes that can reveal a whole dust cosmos. The questions were no longer, is there metal dust, but is the process sufficiently clean? Has the chain of custody been unbroken since day one? Where do we find comparison samples without cross-contaminating science-promised breakthroughs? Procedure reminded everyone that no breakthrough stands without a strict seal chain. The tug between eagerness and caution set the breath of this phase. Yet, every case reaches the moment the machine asks itself, how long will we remain active? The stamp shifting the file out of active investigation is not a slamming door, but a reallocation of energy. It says, from now on, new leads will still be received, but the runners become a watch desk. The thick paper files are slowly digitized, pushed into an open archive where the public may browse like a library, not to solve but to recognize that the story has been socialized in the truest sense. It belongs to all who still care. Opening the file is an act of humility, admitting the agency's horizon is no wider than the community's, and that somewhere in the crowd, a stray pair of eyes may see what the machine missed. That opening birthed another effect, a civil investigation ecosystem, small groups patiently reading thousands of smudged faxes, reconciling timestamps and time zones, cross-checking historical weather logs, photographing dust under careful, inexpensive microscopes, and writing letters to clarify hard-to-read margins. Sometimes the relationship between agency and community resembled a finicky dance. One keeps time by rule, the other improvises with ideas. When they understood each other, the case moved a step. When they didn't, the press had cause to raise another swell of feeling. At this stage, side stories gained weight: who holds the evidence room keys, who approves viewing when an envelope was opened, which tweezers touched the fabric. Each tiny detail, if not written down, becomes a crack in the court of public opinion. The more sophisticated the science, the sharper the question of cleanliness. A dust mote might be a key to a factory, or a star fallen from a display broom at a decades-old public showing. Evidence custodians thus learned a new craft: storytelling. They had to narrate each item's journey as if they were writing a life history. Do not forget the machine's primal function: guarding legal boundaries. While the public is entranced by fresh theories, the apparatus keeps asking, would any of this stand in court? Would a new examination intrude on someone's privacy based on a threadbare assumption? Are we chasing a good story or a sound argument? These dry questions repeatedly cool a room already chilled by procedure, but they prevent the case from sliding onto a stage. As boxes went digital for anyone to read, a paradox emerged. The mystery didn't shrink, it swelled. Each reader noticed a different detail. Each detail opened a side corridor. Each corridor attracted a group with lanterns. The Cooper Vortex, a whirl of debates, podcasts, meetups, documentaries, spun out of this. It drew fuel from two sources: an agency that learned to share and a community that learned to study. Between them stood the press, the mill that grinds everything into easy grains, sometimes too fine to nourish. The move to suspend active pursuit is a rest beat. It lets the agency step out of the endless chase while keeping a door open for any knock hard enough. Strangely, the rest made other sounds clearer. The geomorphologist tracing sand lines, the dust analyst speaking of mills, ordinary people bridging local memory with smudged notes. Thus, the case didn't die. It changed its mode of life from a distance runner to a candle passed hand to hand. Leaving the glass front building, we carry a contrary feeling: gratitude for a machine that kept the story intact to this day, and a clear sense of the limits any institution faces before a mystery engineered to sit at the edge of plausibility. It isn't that they don't want to know, they must know in ways that can be demonstrated, and demonstrable can be the rarest commodity in tales born of rainy nights and a metal stare. From the agency's door, the story naturally moves into town cafes, podcast studios, online forums, small halls lit warm. There, the phenomenon has a nickname of its own: the Cooper Vortex. It isn't mere curiosity. It is the case's second life, where the public is both reader and co-author. To see why it never tires, we need to step into the eye of that vortex: how media, popular culture, and independent investigators together kept this mystery large. Stories born in rainy nights usually fade with dawn. This one didn't. Morning only sharpened it in the public imagination. From newsrooms to kitchen tables, weekend documentaries to the podcasts people play in traffic, an ecosystem took shape. Folks call it, half teasing, half fond, the Cooper Vortex. It pulls in everything: flight path doodles on napkins, phone snaps of river maps, old local clippings, and uncle's anecdotes from a metal shop, even the daydreams of late-night radio listeners. The press, as ever, struck the match. From the start, headlines found an easy rhythm of drama: the courteous man, the jump in the rain, vanished from the sky. Phrases like these stuck to the wall of collective memory without glue. Later, as files opened, the press changed roles from adrenaline raconteur to librarian guide through a maze of documents. Investigative reporters became curators of a living archive, selecting pages worth reading and bridging them with prose sharp yet light enough for anyone to follow. Then came documentaries, a careful blend of fact and craft. Cameras skim riverbanks, linger on a mock rear air stair frame, a tie under a microscope. The narration swells, the paleteer cools, the score tightens. Some films, through archival rigor, genuinely opened new paths. Others, through storytelling talent, made the mystery shine brighter than the gray reality it sprang from. Critics grumble that films play judge too soon. Supporters are grateful that, thanks to them, ordinary viewers first grasp why a speck of metal dust might rattle a man's portrait. Either way, they did something crucial. They gave the public a shared vocabulary for the case, imperfect at times, but enough for strangers to sit down and draw the same map on a cafe napkin. Meanwhile, on forums and in groups, another kind of labor went on quietly, the labor of slow readers. Anonymous handles spend months normalizing timestamps, reconciling time zones, cross-checking historic weather. Someone builds a flight model in home sim software. Someone brings Tina bar sand to a bathroom to watch it settle in a glass tub. These gentle experiments aren't big science, but they honor the virtues of science, replication, verification, humble correction. From this user cloud, popular theories lose their gloss, and from it, tiny details too small for busy newsrooms find their exact place in the picture. The vortex spins not just on data, but on feeling. It nurtures an odd community. People who argue fiercely, yet share high-res scans, who distrust each other, yet meet by the river on weekends. At small meetups, someone lays out a black and white print of the flight profile, someone else plunks down a thrifted 1971 style tie as prop. A woman who lived near hunting grounds recalls nights with strange noises. A retired machinist lifts a coffee stirrer like a ruler to explain 15 degrees of flap. People laugh, but not in mockery. They laugh because, in that moment, the mystery belongs to them, not only to an agency or a film crew. Where there's community, there's discussion ethics to guard. The vortex sometimes blows past private boundaries. A name repeats until it hardens into identity, despite families pleading for restraint. A home map gets posted for investigation, really, to feed curiosity. Then moderators, professional reporters, and decent filmmakers must play reluctant gatekeepers, restate rules, delete posts, lock threads, explain why a mystery isn't a permit for every act. On the bright side, the vortex is where disciplines touch. A geomorphologist drops into a diatom thread with basic primers. Suddenly, everyone can tell spring from summer blooms. An airline engineer, irked by mangled numbers, writes a long post simplifying equations and turning jargon into examples. An evidence room clerk lays out the chain of custody workflow, and that single post chokes off a dozen reckless contamination claims. These crossings make the vortex nutritious. No longer a whirlwind of rumor, it becomes a monsoon carrying the moisture of knowledge. Of course, amid cool breezes whirl hot eddies of hoax and hype. Each time a new exhibit appears, a barn parachute, a strange note in a shop ledger, the vortex accelerates. The sober-ask provenance chain of custody controls the hasty draft plots on the spot. The lesson never ages. Speed is the enemy of accuracy. If the vortex has a virtue, it keeps relearning its slowness. Still, it's the vortex that kept the case alive. It turned a file destined for drowsy shelves into an interdisciplinary story, geomorphology, holding hands with metallurgy, aviation, talking to ecology, journalism, sharing a house with careful amateurs. In the digital age, a mystery doesn't live in a single cabinet. It lives on thousands of hard drives and spreadsheets, flying around the world in evening video calls where people feed the cat while debating approach angles. Close the laptop, put away the headphones, the vortex doesn't vanish. It reverts to background wind, stirring half-finished thoughts. The man who jumped into the rainy night seems to stand at every window looking in at the warm light and asking one question. Have you thought of everything? Each person, reporter, scientist, anonymous user, answers quietly the next day by doing a small task. Read another page, recheck, a figure leave a polite reminder under a heated post. The vortex that way doesn't dizzy us, it toughens us. Stepping out of the eye, we reach the ground of composite scenarios. Having traveled, aircraft evidence sandbarred us, diatoms drop maps, suspects, and the official machine, the task is not to choose a tidy truth, but to build robust stories, fit each shard into a structure, and see how long it stands under reality's weight. Two drafts wait at the sky's edge, survival and fatality. We will invite them and seat them and let each tell its tale. With all the fragments laid out, the air stair and flight settings, the tie glittering with industrial dust, diatoms and paper fibers, Tina Barr's sand-buried bundles, a landing map wavering between forest and suburb, a hallway of suspects, and the investigative machine, the story arrives at a fork. One branch opens on to the road of a survivor who slipped into ordinary life, keeping an old secret hung as neatly as a coat on a peg. The other descends into the valley of accident rain. Night breaks a landing forest, closes its mouth, the river takes the pieces, and time finishes the rest. These aren't enemy camps so much as two drafts that overwrite, delete, insert, and even borrow lines from each other. We read each one slowly like a diary of our own. In the first draft, survival leaving the air stair isn't a plunge, but a move long practiced in the mind. He counts, wind trims, posture clears, the tail wash pulls at the moment his body already knows the air's grip. The canopy blooms like a black flower in rain. The weighted bag drags him on a slant without stealing control. Below lies not a wall of timber, but the rim of lowland wet pasture fence, lines a pale thread of highway. He lands hard, but unbroken. Knees sting, a shoulder aches from the harness bite, but bones hold. This draft requires a psychological trait, composure. He strips the canopy, shoves it into brush pulls, a second coat from a tucked pouch, changes his silhouette, drops the brim of a hat. The money cinch at his hip gets checked and covered. He walks toward light blends into midnight as a trucker grabbing coffee. If asked, he's a motel guest out for cold air. A cheap coffee receipt, a local paper bought quick, a night in a room with old smoke in the curtains. This is how he sinks to a new rhythm. By morning, he is farther down the interstate, new car, new coat, new name. But ransom money isn't clean. Serial numbers are its DNA. The survivor knows this. He doesn't spend freely. Part is stashed where water maps change river edges, bar ends, a garden scrap with fuzzy boundaries. He picks a place that looks safe enough, or plans to return, or simply wants to shed weight. Then flood, or an anonymous 1974 dredging campaign moves the cash. It sinks, snags, buries, gets exhumed, and one day Tina Bar points with a child's finger. $5.800 surfaces like the capital letter of an unfinished sentence. Where's the rest? Perhaps in another sand hole, perhaps unraveled, perhaps inside a wall of a house long sold. In survival, the tie's metal dust carries weight. It sketches a person of the shop metals aerospace or a line near expensive materials. He speaks in numbers, flaps, speed, altitude gauges. The rain sets conditions. He isn't a red-faced gambler, but a backward chess player accepting silence over applause. If he lived, his post-jump life would lack fireworks. It would be suspiciously ordinary punctual shifts, closed blinds, a secret kept like a habit. Sometimes mid-dinner a far look skims his eyes like a plain shadow across a ceiling. Before dying, maybe he says something oblique. Maybe he doesn't. The best secret is the one that doesn't need a keeper. Draft 2, Fatality, begins with a small error. A gust, a skewed harness, from the money's weight, a brief hesitation that tips the fall into a spin. The canopy opens, but the forest edge twists the wind into disobedience. Tall firs tear the fabric and drag the body down at a cruel angle. He hits with enough force for darkness to close. Rain persists, cold saws through cloth. No fire, no lamplight, no people. The post-impact body isn't shattered, but shock is quiet capillaries, leaking in the brain hairline rib fractures, hands shaking at the buckles. If death is not instant, hypothermia arrives at dawn. The northwest forest, like an overbearing mother, wraps a child it does not recognize. Here the money bag ceases to be luggage and becomes ballast, yanking the corpse into an odd posture. After a few seasons, rubber bands rot, cords rot, duff rots. A bank slump and flood peels the cachie into the current. It doesn't travel alone. It goes with mud, sand, and bark, and with the ground's own secrets. In a natural hollow, it rests diatom sign, water signs, time signs. Then a blind God's hand, the dredge scoops the sediment slab and tips it at Tina Bar, an unplanned cemetery. Bundles keep their outline not because anyone cradled them, but because wet sand served as a mold. $5.800 testifies. The rest dissolves into the river's language. In Fatality, the tie still narrates the shop floor years, but as a portrait left behind a vanished subject. It explains why he could set parameters. It cannot guarantee weather's mercy. The tie's years precede the rainy night. They cannot veto the forest's one bad hour. And more, the Northwest forest has a way of erasing witnesses other places lack. Fir needles fall, duff thickens fungi, and roots knit like neural nets. A body in 2 years can turn into the land's memory. You don't get a femur waiting in daylight. You get minerals nourishing saplings. Side by side, the drafts are variations on a theme. They share instruments. Rain, wind, air stair tie, diatoms, Tina Bar but peak differently. Survival crests with costume change. Fatality with a forest rim swallowing light. Both have holes. Survival must answer why no cereal bills ever reappeared and why no post-jump trails show in a later life. If he was that smart, the aftermath would be filament thin. Fatality must persuade on why no gear turned up and why bundles kept their form. Questions geomorphology and diatoms address, partly still leaving a burr. If forced to lean where prudence warns against decree, yet weighing what we have, the precision of technical requests, the jump's edge of possible configuration, the rimland geography, the money's dredge-era journey, and the later life silence, the scale tilts slightly toward thin survival, thin disappearance. Not because it's more cinematic, but because it best uses what we know about him a control seeker, choosing seams and knowing hot money, only slightly. Every time we picture him changing coats in a phone booth, the rain's gust stands up to remind us a tail-wash swirl can wreck any script. Can the drafts converge? Yes, if we accept that a person can both survive and die within one life. Imagine he lands, departs, gets a distance, then accident comes late, a deep ditch, a misstep, a cold shock. Money hid earlier or falls in a second stagger. The hybrid is ugly but human. It preserves the agency of a man skilled enough to clear the air stair and the grim chance that ends the story before any later life. It also fits diatoms and dredging time underwater, then a mechanical lift. Its flaw is stealing public favorites' clarity. In good mysteries, clarity is often a luxury. Set the pen down and notice the task isn't to pick a side, but to balance the shards. Metal dust schooling us in trades, water in seasons, drop maps in terrain, the machine in procedure. A good scenario doesn't just read well. It must stand before those four voices. If it wobbles, our job is to brace it, not to smash it. From this fork, the path turns toward an open-ended closing, not to shut the mystery, but to see it in a wider frame, a story about the limits of knowledge, about how communities and institutions co-own a case, about tools that can brighten without burning exhibits, and about the meaning of continuing to ask instead of rushing to answer. We enter the final part with humility, learn from rain, sand, and a cheap tie some secrets, accept us only as polite guests, not as owners. By now, after traveling with the story through slow flight paths, the 727's rear air stair vibrating like a guitar string, the Tina bar sand with the rasp of time, the metallic dust sparkling like a microscopic firmament across a cheap tie, the diatom fields writing a calendar in silica shells, the drop map strung between deep woods and suburb, the suspect corridor of names, each carrying half coincidence and half rebuttal, and the investigative machine that is both persistent and self-aware of fatigue. We can name the only certainty this mystery hasn't died from lack of data. It survives because data keeps changing shape. It endures like an open equation. The more knowns we plug in, the more new solutions the function spits out. At the outermost layer, the D.B. Cooper case is a primer on technical boundaries. A civilian aircraft designed for convenience inadvertently admitted a rare escape scenario. The jump from the rear air stair wasn't a parlor trick, yet it didn't exceed the reach of someone who understood the machine. Precision in requesting flaps altitude speed, if treated as the handwriting of a person, shows a mind that prefers parameters over luck. Here we learn the word edge. Good plans walk the edge of wind, of night, of life and death, of industry and custom. The next layer is a lesson in geomorphology and hydrology, how the river writes subsequent chapters with floods, dredging and migrating sandbars as restless as human memory. The $5,800 appeared not because the bills wanted to speak, but because terrain and time happened to press them into sand within reach of a child's toy shovel. Money doesn't recount the whole journey. It opens a parenthesis. Close it, and we find an investigative ecosystem that has learned the river's language, diatoms instead of vibes, stratigraphy instead of hunch. From that, we learn to respect slowness, a rhythm opposed to the native haste of modern media. A third slender, bright layer lies on a brown strip of cloth, the tie and its metallic sky. Titanium, bismuth, stainless standing alone, they are merely odd dust. In structure, they sketch an occupational map toward alloy plants and aerospace lines. Contamination may exist. Particles may have immigrated during a public showing. Strong argument learns to cross the maybes with controls ratios and non-random repetition. From a small object, we learn to see a world. Good science begins at the microscope, but doesn't end there. The fourth most human layer is people. Suspects together with families, widows, cradling a vague confession, former co-workers, still debating a shift schedule bring flesh to the case. Inside the Cooper vortex, people learn to talk to one another. Engineers explain lift to reporters. Geomorphologists share seasonal diatom tables. Archivists narrate an envelope's chain of custody. Community thus becomes more than a curious crowd. It turns into a distributed lab where tiny knowledge accretes like fresh duff on a forest floor. Lastly, the institutional layer, the investigative machine, sits like a foundation. Without it, the mystery would have dozed off after a few yellowed clippings. With it, the case has moved through generations in an orderly way, exhibits counted, sealed, opened, logged, files digitized so strangers can read and rebut. The decision to suspend active pursuit wasn't surrender, but a change of breathing, making room for the public while guarding the warehouse of law and knowledge, waiting for a knock that's strong enough. In a world where everything risks being staged, this function is a stake in the fog. So, what can be done next without turning the story into empty repetition, first trace evidence? Science still has tight corridors. Remap the tie's fiber surfaces with newer techniques, for example, wide area elemental mapping, correlating particle morphologies to specific processes under strict conservation. Compared to archived dust from historical alloy facilities, if preserved, to hunt distinctive signatures. Second, reconstruct the historical geomorphology of Tinabar and adjacent reaches by numerical models built from dredge logs, period aerials, and snowmelt flood records, a time machine for flow to recheck transport scenarios of paper exhibits. Third, expand open source data mining from digitized local dailies to commercial ledgers to track thin trails after 1971, cash paid motel receipts, emergency clothing, purchases adorn fender bender, sociological dust motes that may bind if someone is patient. Even if these paths don't yield a full portrait, they still matter. They return the case to knowledge's true nature, a perpetual revision process. No one forces us to pick survival or fatality like sides in a match. The real choice is method. A decent method accepts that tomorrow a new particle, a forgotten aerial, or a provincial dredging ledger from 1974 may compel us to rewrite a whole paragraph. When that day comes, don't defend the old story as dogma. Defend verification standards as ethics. Our ending, therefore, doesn't slam the archive door. It only pulls it to, so the draft quiets and the lamp can burn on its own. Outside, the Pacific Northwest sky still hasn't run out of rain. Each season, someone new finds the story bringing a skill. The last cohort lacked a coder who can model flow, a geography teacher who can read satellite images, an old mechanic who can hear an engine's condition in a tailpipe's breath. They intersit together and the case becomes young again. In the best of worlds, a day will come when we lift an answer cleanly into the light, a coordinate and artifact, a robust cross-check. If not, the mystery will remain no failure. It is a mirror for our investigative culture, how patient we are, how fair to the dead and the living, and whether we can keep imagination on a leash held by evidence. often good stories don't teach us to know, but to seek. And for the reader, 3 open questions to carry home. First, if the jumper belonged to the shop floor, a mind loyal to process, why choose a plan with so many natural variables, or did mastery of risk itself let him make risk bow? Second, if $5,800 was the capital letter of a long sentence, where is the rest still in water inside someone's wall, or in a dredging ledger forgotten in a county vault? Third, perhaps the thing to find isn't a name, but a method, one elegant enough that even nameless, we still understand the structure that let a man vanish from the sky. Look up, and the 1971 night still stands there, not a minute older. A metal door cracks open windlashes, and a man leans through. From that last step to now, time is only rings on water. Beneath, among sand on cloth at the forest hem, the truth still lies quiet, waiting for hands light enough.